In the spring of 1994, a man named Errol Vance stood at his own fence line in Marion County, Kentucky, and listened to a Cooperage foreman call the pile of wood behind him garbage. The foreman was not wrong about what it looked like. It looked like garbage. Curled white oak shavings, cracked stave ends, the split and rejected blanks that no barrel would ever hold, all of it dumped against the wire in a heap that had grown for 9 years already and would grow for 4 more. The foreman's name was Dale Pruitt, and he ran the loading yard at the Hollow Run Cooperage a half-mile up the road, and he told Errol that day that the company would keep dropping the cull there because it was cheaper than hauling it to the county burn site, and that Errol should be grateful for free firewood and stop asking questions. He said it, leaning out the window of a flatbed, with the engine running a clipboard on the seat beside him, a man with somewhere to be and a route to keep. He had a tally sheet for the day's loads and a number at the bottom he was paid to keep low, and the heap at the Vance fence was a line on that sheet that cost him nothing. Errol had asked a simple question, whether some of the longer rejects might be sound enough to keep, and Dale Pruitt had heard it as a complaint and answered it as one. He did not look at the wood when he spoke. He looked at his watch. Then he climbed back into his truck and drove off, gravel ticking under the tires, and the pile stayed. 11 years later, in the fall of 2005, a buyer from a kitchenware company in Louisville wrote Errol Vance a single purchase order for $41,000. It was for cutting boards. Every board in that order had been made from the wood Dale Pruitt called garbage. This is the story of the 13 years between those two moments, and of a man who looked at a heap of rejected oak and saw something that nobody with a clipboard could measure. Let me tell you about him, because the way Errol Vance saw wood was not the way the Cooperage saw wood, and that difference is the whole story. Errol was 51 years old that spring of 1994. He had farmed 160 acres of rolling Kentucky, ground his whole life. Tobacco mostly, some cattle, a little corn, the way his father had and his father before him. He was known in the county for 2 things. He was quiet, to the point that people sometimes thought he was slow, and he could read a piece of timber the way a doctor reads an X-ray. He had a small wood shop in the back of his tobacco barn, a place with a single bandsaw older than his marriage, and a wall of hand planes he had inherited and resharpened 10,000 times. He did not make furniture for money. He made it because his grandfather had taught him to, and because he could not stand to see good wood go to waste. And the second of those things is what put him at the fence that day, arguing with a man half his age about a pile of scrap. Tobacco was dying in Kentucky in those years. The federal price support program that had held the small farms together for 60 years was wobbling toward its end, and every farmer in Marion County knew it. Errol's tobacco income had fallen by 1/3 in 5 years. He was not a man who panicked, but he was a man who counted, and the numbers at his kitchen table were getting harder to come out right. So when the Cooperage started dumping Stave scrap at his back fence in 1985, he did not see firewood. He saw white oak. He saw the single most stable, tight-grained, beautiful hardwood that grows in North America, the wood that whiskey barrels are made from precisely because it will hold liquid for years without leaking, and he saw it lying in a heap because it had a knot in the wrong place or a crack at one end. Let me tell you about white oak, because you have to understand. The wood to understand why the Cooperage was throwing away a fortune. A barrel stave has to be nearly perfect. It has to be quarters on, meaning cut, though the growth rings run straight across the thickness of the board, because that is the only orientation that makes the wood watertight and keeps it from warping when it swells and dries 1,000 times over a barrel's life. The Cooperage bought whole logs, sawed them into staves, and rejected everything that did not meet that standard. A blank with a knot, a blank where the grain wandered, a blank that came out a 1/4 inch too thin. To the Cooperage, those rejects were a yield loss, a cost of doing business, a number in red ink that Dale Pruitt was paid to make as small as possible by getting the scrap off the property as cheaply as he could. Dumping it at Errol's fence cost the company nothing. That was the entire logic. But quarters on white oak with a knot in it is still quarters on white oak. The grain that makes it watertight in a barrel makes it dimensionally stable in a board, which is the single most important quality a cutting board can have, because a cutting board that warps is a cutting board that rocks on the counter and splits along a glue line within a year. The Cooperage was measuring one thing, fitness for a barrel, and throwing away wood that was nearly ideal for something it had never thought to make. Errol had thought to make it. He had been thinking about it for 9 years before Dale Pruitt ever told him to be grateful. The day after that argument, at the fence, Errol walked the piles slowly, the way he walked his tobacco rows, and he began to sort. He pulled out the straightest rejects, the ones where the only flaw was a single tight knot or a checking crack he could cut away. He carried an armload to the barn. He ran the first piece through the old bandsaw, and the blade came out the other end through wood so dense and clean that he stood there for a moment, just looking at the cut face at the silver fleck of the medullary rays that only quarters-on oak shows, the grain catching the light like the inside of a seashell. He had cut a lot of wood in 51 years. He had rarely cut anything that nice. His wife, Lorna, came out to the barn that evening and found him still there, a dozen rough boards stacked on the bench and sawdust to his ankles. She was a practical woman who kept the farm's books in a green ledger at the kitchen table, and she asked him what he thought he was doing with a pile of Cooperage trash. He told her he was going to make cutting boards. She asked him who in the world was going to buy a cutting board from a tobacco farmer. He did not have an answer for that yet. He just knew the wood was too good to burn. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it is the heart of everything that followed. A whole industry had decided this wood was worthless. The decision was rational. It was made by people with more knowledge of barrels than Errol Vance would ever have. And it was wrong. Not about barrels, but about the wood, because they had only ever asked the wood one question. Errol asked it a different one. If you have ever known something in your hands that no expert would sign off on, I would like to hear about it sometime. Now let me get back to the boards. He worked at it through the winter of 1994 and into 1995, in the dead months, when tobacco gives a farmer time to think. The first boards were clumsy. He glued them up wrong, and they came apart. He learned slowly by failing, which is how he learned most things. A cutting board is not a simple object if you want it to last. The wood has to be dried, right? Green oak that has not lost its moisture will check and cup, no matter how well it is joined, and the scrap at the fence was every age from fresh to 9 years weathered. So Errol built a drying rack in the loft of the barn and learned to read the moisture in a board by its weight and the sound it made when he tapped it. A board still full of water sat heavy in the hand and answered a knuckle with a dull thud. A board that had given up its moisture rang, a clean, dry note like a struck stave, and Errol learned to trust that note more than any meter. He weighed boards on Lorna's kitchen scale and wrote the weights on the end grain in pencil and weighed them again a month later. And when a board stopped losing weight, he knew it had come to rest with the air of the barn and would not move much again. It was slow, a thick blank took the better part of a year. He had nothing but time and a heap of wood that kept growing faster than he could dry it. He learned that the boards had to be glued so the grain of each strip opposed its neighbor, alternating so that when the wood moved, and wood always moves, the movements would fight each other to a draw instead of all pulling the same way and tearing the board apart. He learned which glue held under a wet knife and which let go in a season, and he learned it the hard way by selling a few early boards that came back to him, split along a seam, and he took every one of those back and remade it, and never argued about it, because a board that failed was his fault, and not the customer's. By the second winter he was wasting almost nothing. A blank too short for a board became a strip in a checkerboard. A strip too narrow became an inlay. The dark walnut from a tree that had come down on the property went in as a band of contrast against the silver oak, and people who saw the boards began to understand they were looking at something a factory could not make at any price, because a factory cannot afford a year of drying and a man's whole attention. Let me tell you about that, because it is the second mechanism, and it is the one that made his boards outlast everyone else's. End grain. A cutting board can be made two ways. Face grain, where you simply glue boards, flat and wide, which is fast and cheap and shows the prettiest figure, and end grain, where you cut the wood into short blocks and stand them on end so the knife comes down into the open tubes of the wood fibers. End grain is brutally hard to make. It requires twice the wood, 4 times the labor, and a glue joint that has to be perfect because end grain wants to drink up glue and starve the joint. Yet an end grain board is self-healing. The knife parts the fibers instead of cutting them, and they close back over the cut, so the board does not scar, does not dull your knives, and lasts 30 or 40 years where a cheap face grain board lasts 3. Errol taught himself end grain construction from a single article in an old woodworking magazine and 10 months of ruined glue-ups. By 1996, he could make an end grain board that would outlive the man who bought it. Which brings me to the part of the story where the farm started to come apart and where you meet the others. In 1998, the federal tobacco program ended for good, and the bottom fell out of every small tobacco farm in Kentucky at once. Errol's neighbor, a younger man named Cole Bramlett, who farmed the 400 acres across the road, had seen it coming and made what every agricultural advisor in the state was telling farmers to make. He made the big bet. Cole borrowed against his land and bought into a tobacco buyout consolidation, leasing quota from a dozen failing farms, buying a new mechanical harvester and 2 grain trucks and a center pivot irrigation rig, betting that he could survive the transition by getting bigger and more efficient than anybody else. The extension agents loved him. He was doing everything right by the book. He was scaling up. He was modernizing. To the bank, Cole Bramlett was the future of farming in Marion County, and Errol Vance, 55 years old and making cutting boards out of barrel scrap in his tobacco barn, was the past. The agent who handled the county's transition program was a man named Wade Tilford, and I want to be fair to Wade because this is not a story with a villain in it. Wade Tilford had a master's degree in agricultural economics from a good university, and he believed, sincerely and with evidence, that the only way a Kentucky farm survived the death of tobacco was to scale, consolidate, and chase efficiency. He had spreadsheets that proved it. He had watched the numbers his whole career. He was not a bad man. He simply believed that what could not be put on a spreadsheet did not count, and Errol Vance's wood shop could not be put on a spreadsheet. Wade came out to Errol's farm in the fall of 1999, as part of a transition assessment, walking the fields in clean tan boots that had never touched real mud, carrying a clipboard with a worksheet that valued a farm by its acreage and its yield and its debt capacity. He stood in the doorway of the tobacco barn and looked at the cutting boards stacked on the drying rack. Hundreds of them now, and he asked Errol what his plan was. Errol said he was making cutting boards. Wade smiled not unkindly and wrote something on his worksheet and said, in the patient voice of a man explaining arithmetic to a child, that a woodworking hobby was fine for evenings, but that it was not a transition strategy, and that Errol needed to think seriously about leasing his ground to an operation like Cole Bramlett's before he lost it. He called it a hobby. He said the word twice, gently, the way you would correct a man who had misunderstood the rules of a game. Then he left, and his clean boots left no mark on the barn floor. Errol did not argue. He almost never argued. He walked Wade Tilford to his car, and when the agent was gone, he went back into the barn and picked up a board he had finished that morning, an end-grain checkerboard of white oak and a few strips of walnut from a tree that had come down on the property. He had $1,000 in cutting board sales that year. Wade was right that it was not enough to save the farm. Wade was wrong about everything else. Let me tell you about the wood itself one more time. Because by 2000 something had begun to happen that nobody had planned. Word had gotten around. Errol had started selling boards at the Saturday farmers market in town, a card table with 20 boards on it. And the boards did not sell fast, but the people who bought one came back. They came back because the boards did not warp. They came back because a board they had bought 2 years ago still looked new, and because when they brought it back to be re-oiled, Errol did it for free, and the board came off his bench looking like the day they bought it. A restaurant in Bardstown bought 4 for its kitchen. The chef there, a woman named Imelda Sarno, who had trained in Chicago and cooked in 3 states before coming home to Kentucky, used those 4 boards 12 hours a day. Every day, the hardest use a cutting board can get, and after a year they had not split, had not cupped, had not worn a groove. She had thrown out $200 worth of factory boards in the same year. The first time she met Errol, she had come out to the farm herself, suspicious because a chef learns to distrust anything that sounds too good, and she had stood in the barn turning a board over, with the flat, assessing look of a woman who handled steel and wood all day. She pressed her thumbnail into the end grain and watched it leave no mark. She asked him what he sealed it with, and he told her food-grade mineral oil and beeswax, nothing else, no finish that could chip into food. She asked him why it did not dull her knives, and he turned the board on its end and showed her the standing fibers, the open tubes, the blade slid into instead of across, and she went quiet the way people went quiet around that wood. She bought 4 that day, and came back for 2 more before the year was out. She started telling people, and a chef, telling people, is worth more than any advertisement a factory ever bought, because a chef has staked her own knives on the claim. The skeptic in this story arrived in the summer of 2001, and she arrived in Errol's own kitchen. His granddaughter, Daria Vance, was 23 that summer, and she had just finished a business degree at the University of Kentucky, and she came home to help her grandparents wind the farm down because everyone in the family had agreed it was time. Daria loved her grandfather. She also thought he was wasting the last good years of his life on a card table of cutting boards while the farm slid toward a sale, and she was not shy about saying so. She had spreadsheets, too. She had learned from the same book Wade Tilford had. She sat at the kitchen table that first week home and showed Errol, in neat columns, that his woodshop earned $4 an hour for his labor, when you counted it honestly, and that he should stop. Errol listened to all of it. Then he asked her one question. He asked her how much a factory cutting board sold for and how long it lasted, and how much his sold for and how long his lasted. Daria, who was honest, did the division. A $20 board that lasted 3 years cost a little under $7 a year. One of Errol's boards sold for $80 and lasted 40 years and cost $2 a year, and would be handed to a grandchild still working. She looked at her own numbers for a long time. She did not say anything that night. Yet she had felt the column move under her, the way you feel a floor shift, and the certainty she had brought home from the university had developed, for the first time, a hairline crack. She started, almost against her will, to pay attention. She watched her grandfather work. She watched him take a reject blank that the Cooperage had thrown away because of a single knot and turn it on the saw so the knot became the center of a pattern, a dark eye in a field of silver grain, and she watched a customer pay extra for that exact board because of the knot the Cooperage had rejected it for. He had been taught that a flaw was a flaw, a deduction from value, a thing to be sorted out and discarded. And here was her grandfather selling the flaw at a premium, because he had learned to compose with it instead of against it. She began to understand that her grandfather was not running a hobby that happened to make a little money. He was running a business whose entire supply cost was zero, whose raw material was a premium hardwood that an industry was paying to throw away, and whose product commanded a premium price precisely because it was better than anything a factory could make. She had been taught to find inefficiencies and eliminate them. She was looking at the most efficient operation she had ever seen, and she had almost talked him out of it. She kept finding more of it, the longer she looked. The factory boards, she had grown up assuming were the sensible choice, were made of fast-grown wood, glued flat, and finished with a coating that hid the cheapness for a year or two. Designed, she realized, to be replaced. Her grandfather's boards were designed to be inherited. The whole logic of the things she had learned at the university, that you lowered cost and raised volume and let the market sort the rest, ran exactly backward to what she was watching succeed in a tobacco barn. Errol did not lower his cost because his cost was already nothing. He did not raise his volume because raising it would have meant lowering the thing that made the boards worth buying. He had found the one place where the rules she had memorized did not apply, and he had found it not with a degree but with his hands and 40 years of looking at wood. Daria did not quit and take up woodworking overnight. That is not how a mind changes. That fall, though, she rebuilt her grandfather's non-existent bookkeeping into a real set of accounts, and she was the one who noticed in those accounts that demand was running 3 times ahead of what one old man with one bandsaw could supply. People were waiting 4 months for a board. She asked him if he wanted to make more. He said he wanted to make them right. She understood slowly that those were not the same goal, and that her grandfather had chosen the first one on purpose, and she began to wonder whether the university had taught her the wrong religion. Across the road, Cole Bramlett was having a different kind of year. On paper, he was the most successful farmer in the county. The consolidation, though, had been built entirely on borrowed money, and a single bet that the price of the commodity crops he had switched to would hold, and that the cost of the diesel and fertilizer and chemicals his big, efficient operation devoured. He had a magnificent new sprayer that cost more than Errol's entire farm was worth, and from the road it looked like prosperity itself, rolling across those wide, leased fields, throwing a fine mist in the evening light. Up close, it was a machine that had to run almost every acre, every season, just to service the debt that had bought it. There was no slack in it anywhere. It was the most efficient farm in Marion County, and efficiency, as Errol could have told anyone who asked, is just another word for having no room to be wrong. Then came the years that decided everything. In 2003, diesel prices began to climb, and they did not stop. Fertilizer, which is made from natural gas, climbed with them. Cole Bramlett's input costs rose by 40% over 2 seasons, and because his entire operation was built on thin commodity margins at enormous scale, a 40% rise in his costs did not shrink his profit. It erased it. The same scale that had made him the model farm made him the most exposed farm, because every acre that had been a small profit was now a small loss, and he had 900 of them. A man with 40 acres in a bad year loses 40 acres of margin. A man with 900 loses 900, and Cole had borrowed against the land itself to assemble them, so the loss did not stop at the season. It came due at the bank. The magnificent sprayer that had cost more than Errol's whole farm still had to run, because a financed machine sitting idle is a pure loss. So Cole ran it across fields that would not pay for the diesel it burned, throwing its fine mist into evenings that were no longer beautiful to him at all. The bank that had loved him began to call. The extension office that had held him up as the future grew quiet. In the fall of 2004, Cole Bramlett sat at Errol's kitchen table, a proud man with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and could not finish a sentence about what was coming. He had followed every piece of advice he had been given. He had done everything the smart men told him to do, and he said as much, his voice catching on the word everything. And then he stopped and could not go on. Errol did not lecture him. He had never once said, "I told you so," to anyone in his life. He just sat with his neighbor in the kitchen while the man's voice broke, and then he went out to the barn and brought back a cutting board and put it in Cole's truck without a word, because it was the only thing he had to give. I told you this story had no villain, and it does not, but it has a reckoning. And the reckoning came for the whole confident logic of scale at once. Wade Tilford's spreadsheets had been right about the arithmetic of efficiency and wrong about the arithmetic of risk. The model measured the profit of the average year and never the cost of the bad one. It valued the loud, fast, borrowed path and could not see the quiet, slow, debt-free one running underneath it the whole time, because while Cole Bramlett's costs were erasing his profit, Errol Vance's costs were still zero. The Cooperage was still dumping stave scrap at his fence free by the truckload, more than he could ever use. His only inputs were glue, oil, sandpaper, and his own hands, and none of those had a price that diesel could move. In 2004, the same year, his neighbor's empire began to fold. Errol Vance's cutting boards earned him $19,000, more than his tobacco had earned in its last 3 years combined, and he had not borrowed a cent or bought a single acre to do it. The farm that everyone had been planning to sell was paying for itself out of a barn with garbage. Daria saw it first in her own ledgers, the lines crossing. She had come home certain her grandfather was finished, and the future belonged to men like Cole and to plans like Wade's. She watched the future arrive and break the plan and spare the old man, and she understood at last that she had been measuring the wrong things her whole education. That winter she stopped being a granddaughter helping wind a farm down and became an apprentice. She asked Errol to teach her end grain. He handed her a reject blank with a knot in it and showed her how to find the pattern in the flaw. And she ruined a dozen glue-ups the way he had, and learned the way he had. The business that one old man could not keep up with became a business that 2 people built into something that could. It was Daria who took the boards to the kitchenware buyer in Louisville in the fall of 2005. She had grown up enough to know what her grandfather would never have done for himself, which was ask. The buyer was a careful man named Roy Esler, who sourced for a regional chain of kitchen stores and had seen 10,000 cutting boards in his life, factory boards from 3 continents, and he was not easy to impress. Daria brought him one of Errol's end grain boards, white oak with a single walnut inlay where a knot had been, and she set it on his desk and said nothing, which was a thing she had learned from her grandfather. Roy Esler picked it up. He turned it over. Has He ran his thumb across the end grain and felt how the surface had been finished to something past smooth, and he looked at the silver fleck of the quarters-on oak catching the light from his window, and he was quiet for a long time. He asked her where the wood came from. Daria told him the truth. She told him it was barrel stave scrap that a Cooperage paid to throw away. Quarters-on white oak that was rejected for one flaw, and was very nearly perfect for everything else. Roy Esler set the board down. He had spent his whole career learning to tell good from cheap, and he was holding something he could not buy anywhere on earth, made of wood that cost nothing, and he understood in that moment that everything he knew about the price of quality had just been stood on its head. He did not negotiate. That is the part Daria remembered for the rest of her life, that a man whose entire job was to negotiate price simply did not. He asked her what she could supply in a year, and he wrote a purchase order on the spot. $41,000. He slid it across the desk, and Daria looked at the number, and she thought of the green ledger at her grandmother's kitchen table, and of the $4 an hour she had calculated 4 years before with such confidence, and of the word hobby, spoken twice in a patient voice in a barn doorway. The number sat there on the desk and did not move. It was more money than the cutting boards had earned in all 11 years before it combined. It had been made entirely out of something an industry was paying to destroy, found by a man that same industry had told to be grateful and stop asking questions. She drove home with the order on the seat beside her, and she did not turn on the radio the whole way. When she put it in front of Errol at the kitchen table, he read it slowly, the way he read everything. He did not whoop. He did not call anyone. He set the paper down and looked out the window toward the back fence, where the pile still sat. 13 years of it now, and after a while he said that they were going to need a bigger drying rack. That was all. Lorna laughed, and then she cried a little, and Errol got up and went out to the barn because there was a board on the bench that needed its second coat of oil, and the order did not change that. Wade Tilford heard about it the way news travels in a small county, sideways and slow. He came back out to the Vance farm in the spring of 2006, and this time he did not bring a clipboard. He stood in the doorway of the tobacco barn where 6 years before he had said the word hobby, and he looked at the operation now. The racks of drying oak, the second bandsaw Daria, at the bench with sawdust on her sleeves, the wall where the purchase orders were pinned. He had spent the years since the buyout watching the farms he had advised toward scale come apart one after another. Cole Bramlett's the largest and the loudest, and he had begun, in the privacy of his own kitchen at night, to wonder whether the model he had carried into every farm in the county had measured the right things. He had not said that wonder out loud to anyone. He said it here, in a way, by coming. Then he did the thing that makes him, to my mind, the best kind of man in a story like this. He did not make an excuse. He stood there in his good boots and asked an old tobacco farmer to explain the thing his master's degree had taught him to dismiss. And Errol, who held no grudges because grudges were one more thing he could not be bothered to make room for, set down his oil rag and showed him. He showed him the quarters-on grain and the medullary rays. He showed him why the Coopers threw it away and why they were wrong. He showed him the alternating glue-up and the end grain and the self-healing surface. He let Wade hold a finished board and feel its weight and run a thumb across a surface that had been worked past smooth, and he watched the agent's face do the thing every face did around that wood, the suspicion giving way to something closer to wonder. Wade Tilford listened to all of it with the attention of a man who has just discovered that the foundation he built his career on had a room in it he never opened. And when it was over, he shook Errol's hand and said he was sorry he had called it a hobby. Errol said it was an easy thing to call it. Then he gave Wade a board, because by then, giving people boards was simply what he did. Let me tell you what happened to the wood, because the end of this is not really about the money. The Cooperage, Hollow Run, eventually noticed that the farmer they had been dumping scrap on for years was turning it into a product that sold in Louisville, and there was a season where the new yard manager, a man who had replaced Dale Pruitt, talked about charging Errol for the scrap or selling it to him by the ton. Daria, who handled the business now, sat down with the Cooperage's books and showed them, gently and with numbers, that hauling the coal to Errol's fence still cost them less than trucking it to the burn site, and that they had been paying to destroy it for decades, and that the arrangement that had looked like charity to a foolish old farmer had in fact been the cheapest disposal contract the Cooperage ever had. They kept dumping it. They dump it still, or did the last I knew, and the Vance family has never paid $1 for the wood that built everything they have. By 2010, the brand had a name and a small shop with 4 employees, all of them local, 2 of them sons of farmers whose ground had gone the way of Cole Bramlett's. Cole himself lost most of the leased acreage and kept his original 400. And Errol, who never gloated, hired Cole's oldest boy to run the drying operation, and that was the closest Errol ever came to saying anything at all about who had been right. The boy turned out to have his father's gift for systems and none of the debt, and under him, the drying loft became a real operation. Racks, labeled by year, a moisture log kept in a notebook, the way Errol had kept the weights in pencil. Neighbors who had once pitied the old man at his card table came back now to learn, and Errol taught any of them who asked, the same way he had taught Daria, by handing them a flawed blank and showing them the pattern hiding in the flaw. He sold them nothing and kept nothing back. The boards went out into the world, thousands of them a year, every one made from wood an industry had condemned, and every one carrying a small burned mark on the bottom that was not a logo so much as a fact. The name of a farm that had refused to believe the experts about what its garbage was worth. Daria runs it. Now, Errol worked at the bench until he was past 80, slowing but never stopping. And the last boards he made are in the family still, the grain catching the light the way it caught it that first evening in 1994 when he stood in the sawdust and could not stop looking at the cut face. There's one of them on the kitchen table where the green ledger used to sit, white oak and walnut, a dark knot at its center that the Cooperage rejected a whole barrel for, worn now to a soft sheen by 20 years of bread and onions and Sunday mornings, and it has not warped, and it has not split, and it will outlast everyone who reads this. So here is the thing the spreadsheets never found, and it is worth saying plainly. There are 2 kinds of knowing in this world. There is the wide, fast, confident kind that measures what is easy to measure and builds its certainty on the average of good years. The kind Wade Tilford brought in his clipboard, and Cole Bramlett bet his land on, and Daria carried home from the university. And there is the narrow, slow, patient kind that lives in one man's hands and one piece of ground, that asks a different question of the world than the question everyone else is asking, that knows white oak by its weight and its sound. The first kind is not wrong about barrels. It is only wrong about everything the barrel cannot hold. The cooperage measured the wood for one purpose and called the rest of it garbage, and a quiet man at a fence line spent 13 years proving that the rest of it was the better part. What a system measures and what a thing is worth are not the same, and they have never been the same, and the gap between them is where the patient people live. The pile is still there at the fence, the boards are still on the bench. And somewhere in a kitchen tonight, a knife is coming down into white oak that closes back over the cut and waits the way good wood waits, the way Errol Vance waited, for someone with the sense to see what it was.